Racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It is the notion of ascribing moral, social, or political significance to a man's genetic lineage, the notion that a man's intellectual and characterological traits are produced and transmitted by his internal body chemistry. This is the caveman's version of the doctrine of innate ideas, or of inherited knowledge, which has been thoroughly refuted by philosophy and science. Racism is a doctrine of buy-in for brutes. It is a barnyard or stock farm version of collectivism, appropriate to a mentality that differentiates between various breeds of animals, but not between animals and men. Racism negates two aspects of man's life, reason and choice, or mind and morality, replacing them with chemical predestination. Modern racists attempt to prove the superiority or inferiority of a given race by the historical achievements of some of its members. Just as there is no such thing as a collective or racial mind, so there is no such thing as a collective or racial achievement. There are only individual minds and individual achievements, and a culture is not the anonymous product of undifferentiated masses, but the sum of the intellectual achievements of individual men. It is hard to say which is the more outrageous injustice, the claim of Southern racists that a Negro genius should be treated as an inferior because his race has produced some brutes, or the claim of a German brute to the status of a superior because his race has produced Goethe, Schiller, and Brahms. These are not two different claims, of course, but two applications of the same basic premise. Like every other form of collectivism, racism is a quest for the unearned. It is a quest for automatic knowledge, for an automatic evaluation of men's characters that bypasses the responsibility of exercising rational or moral judgment, and, above all, a quest for an automatic self-esteem, or pseudo-self-esteem. The overwhelming majority of racists are men who have earned no sense of personal identity, who can claim no individual achievement or distinction, and who seek the illusion of a tribal self-esteem by alleging the inferiority of some other tribe. Historically, racism has always risen or fallen with the rise or fall of collectivism. And, since there is no rational justification for such rule, since none has ever been or can ever be offered, the mystique of racism is a crucial element in every variant of the absolute state. There is only one antidote to racism, the philosophy of individualism and its politico-economic corollary, laissez-faire capitalism. Individualism regards man, every man, as an independent, sovereign entity who possesses an inalienable right to his own life, a right derived from his nature as a rational being. Individualism holds that a civilized society, or any form of association, cooperation, or peaceful coexistence among men, can be achieved only on the basis of the recognition of individual rights, and that a group, as such, has no rights other than the individual rights of its members. It is not a man's ancestors or relatives or genes or body chemistry that count in a free market, but only one human attribute, productive ability. It is by his own individual ability and ambition that capitalism judges a man and rewards him accordingly. No political system can establish universal rationality by law or by force. But capitalism is the only system that functions in a way which rewards rationality and penalizes all forms of irrationality, including racism. A fully free, capitalist system has not yet existed anywhere. It is capitalism that gave mankind its first steps toward freedom and a rational way of life. It is capitalism that broke through national and racial barriers, by means of free trade. It is capitalism that abolished serfdom and slavery in all the civilized countries of the world. It is the capitalist North that destroyed the slavery of the agrarian feudal South in the United States. Such was the trend of mankind for the brief span of some 150 years. The rise of collectivism reversed that trend. When men began to be indoctrinated once more with the notion that the individual possesses no rights, that supremacy, moral authority, and unlimited power belong to the group, and that a man has no significance outside his group, the inevitable consequence was that men began to gravitate towards some group or another, in self-protection, in bewilderment, and in subconscious terror. The simplest collective to join, the easiest one to identify, particularly for people of limited intelligence, the least demanding form of belonging and of togetherness is race. It is thus that the theoreticians of collectivism, the humanitarian advocates of a benevolent absolute state, have led to the rebirth and the new, virulent growth of racism in the 20th century. The major victims of such race prejudice as did exist in America were the Negroes. The persecution of Negroes in the South was and is truly disgraceful. But in the rest of the country, so long as men were free, even that problem was slowly giving way under the pressure of enlightenment and of the white men's own economic interests. Today, that problem is growing worse, and so is every other form of racism. America has become race-conscious in a manner reminiscent of the worst days in the most backward countries of 19th century Europe. The cause is the same: the growth of collectivism and statism. In spite of the clamor for racial equality, propagated by the liberals in the past few decades, the Census Bureau reported recently that the Negro's economic status relative to whites has not improved for nearly 20 years. It had been improving in the freer years of our mixed economy. It deteriorated with the progressive enlargement of the liberals' welfare state. A mixed economy disintegrates a country into an institutionalized civil war of pressure groups, each fighting for legislative favors and special privileges at the expense of one another. The existence of such pressure groups, and of their political lobbies, is openly and cynically acknowledged today. In the absence of any coherent political philosophy, every economic group has been acting as its own destroyer, selling out its future for some momentary privilege. The policy of the Southern states toward Negroes was and is a shameful contradiction of this country's basic principles. Racial discrimination, imposed and enforced by law, is so blatantly inexcusable an infringement of individual rights that the racist statutes of the South should have been declared unconstitutional long ago. The Southern racists' claim of states' rights is a contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing as the right of some men to violate the rights of others. The constitutional concept of states' rights pertains to the division of power between local and national authorities, and serves to protect the states from the federal government. It does not grant to a state government an unlimited, arbitrary power over its citizens or the privilege of abrogating the citizens' individual rights. It is true that the federal government has used the racial issue to enlarge its own power and set a precedent of encroachment upon the legitimate rights of the states, in an unnecessary and unconstitutional manner. But this merely means that both governments are wrong. It does not excuse the policy of the Southern racists. Men who deny individual rights cannot claim, defend, or uphold any rights whatsoever. It is such alleged champions of capitalism who are helping to discredit and destroy it. The liberals are guilty of the same contradiction, but in a different form. They advocate the sacrifice of all individual rights to unlimited majority rule, yet posture as defenders of the rights of minorities. But the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. This accumulation of contradictions, of short-sighted pragmatism, of cynical contempt for principles, of outrageous irrationality, has now reached its climax in the new demands of the Negro leaders. Instead of fighting against racial discrimination, they are demanding that racial discrimination be legalized and enforced. Instead of fighting against racism, they are demanding the establishment of racial quotas. Instead of fighting for color blindness in social and economic issues, they are proclaiming that color blindness is evil and that color should be made a primary consideration. Instead of fighting for equal rights, they are demanding special race privileges. They are demanding that racial quotas be established in regard to employment and that jobs be distributed on a racial basis, in proportion to the percentage of a given race among the local population. Racial quotas have been one of the worst evils of racist regimes. One of the accusations against the racists in this country is that some schools practice a secret system of racial quotas. It was regarded as a victory for justice when employment questionnaires ceased to inquire about an applicant's race or religion. Today, it is not an oppressor, but an oppressed minority group that is demanding the establishment of racial quotas. It does not merely demand special privileges on racial grounds, it demands that white men be penalized for the sins of their ancestors. It means that white laborer is to be charged with collective racial guilt, the guilt consisting merely of the color of his skin. But that is the principle of the worst Southern racist who charges all Negroes with collective racial guilt for any crime committed by an individual Negro. That absurdly evil policy is destroying the moral base of the Negroes' fight. Their case rested on the principle of individual rights. If they demand the violation of the rights of others, they negate and forfeit their own. Then the same answer applies to them as to the Southern racists: there can be no such thing as the right of some men to violate the rights of others. Yet the entire policy of the Negro leaders is now moving in that direction. For instance, the demand for racial quotas in schools, with the proposal that hundreds of children, white and Negro, be forced to attend school in distant neighborhoods, for the purpose of racial balance. Again, this is pure racism. As opponents of this demand have pointed out, to assign children to certain schools by reason of their race is equally evil whether one does it for purposes of segregation or integration. And the mere idea of using children as pawns in a political game should outrage all parents, of any race, creed, or color. It is proper to forbid all discrimination in government-owned facilities and establishments. The government has no right to discriminate against any citizens. And by the very same principle, the government has no right to discriminate for some citizens at the expense of others. It has no right to violate the right of private property by forbidding discrimination in privately owned establishments. No man, neither Negro nor white, has any claim to the property of another man. A man's rights are not violated by a private individual's refusal to deal with him. Racism is an evil, irrational and morally contemptible doctrine, but doctrines cannot be forbidden or prescribed by law. Just as we have to protect a communist's freedom of speech, even though his doctrines are evil, so we have to protect a racist's right to the use and disposal of his own property. Private racism is not a legal, but a moral issue, and can be fought only by private means, such as economic boycott or social ostracism. It is an ironic demonstration of the philosophical insanity and the consequently suicidal trend of our age, that the men who need the protection of individual rights most urgently, the Negroes, are now in the vanguard of the destruction of these rights.